Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for Levan book chat on Evelyn Alsultany's new book, Broken, the Failed Promise of Muslim Inclusion, published this year by NYU Press. Joining us today to discuss the book are Suad Abdul Kabir from the University of Michigan and Alex Lubin from Penn State. And our moderator today will be our colleague Sarah Benet-Weiser. A few note about housekeeping. If you're able to turn on your camera, please do so. It is always nice to see who is joining us. The program will end at 1, and our time, roughly the first half, will be an introduction to the book by Evelyn, and then a conversation between Evelyn, Suad, and Alex. And at the very end, we will have about 20-25 minutes for questions from the audience. Thank you so much to our guests for joining us. And Evelyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Before I tell you about the book, I would like to thank Daniela Bleichmar and Isabella Carr for organizing this event, and Sarah Benet-Weiser, Suad Abdul Kabir, and Alex Lubin, whose work I admire so much, for agreeing to be here in conversation with me. And thanks to all of you who took time out of your day to join us. So my book, here it is, Broken, the Failed Promise of Muslim Inclusion, examines the process through which Muslims have come to be included in diversity initiatives in the United States. And even though Islamophobia is old, there's a lot of debate as to when Islamophobia began. Some say it's as old as the beginning of Islam in the 7th century. It actually didn't become part of our lexicon in the United States until the 2010s. And so the book looks at what happens when Islamophobia comes to be recognized as a problem and opens up an opportunity for Muslims to become included in diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, which is also on the rise at the same time period. My main argument in the book is that Muslims come to be included in moments of crisis. By crisis, I mean recognition of a hate crime that takes place. The Muslim ban would be the apex of crisis that has been recognized in the last 10 years. So it looks at how moments of crisis make inclusion possible. And I call this crisis diversity in my book, which refers to a common process, it's not unique to Muslims, in terms of how diversity is practiced today in the United States, where something happens that illuminates a longstanding problem. So I'll take the Muslim ban as an example right now. The public recognizes it as a problem. And then there's a flurry of responses. It galvanizes action. So corporations might issue statements denouncing Islamophobia. Universities might create initiatives to include Muslims by, for example, adding more reflection spaces on campuses so that religious Muslim students can pray. Corporations like Nike might have a Muslim woman in a hijab in one of their advertisements. So there's a lot of flurry of activity. Those of us who do this kind of work are called upon to consult and do workshops and educate. And then the moment dies down and there's very little attention paid to the problem until the next crisis emerges. So in the book, I am examining the possibilities and limits of this crisis diversity approach. It does lead to some change. So it gave us Rami on Hulu, it gave us Mo on Netflix, it gave us Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, who are the first Muslim women in Congress. But at the same time, is it actually reducing anti-Muslim racism? So one of my critiques in the book is that the crisis response only takes us to a very limited place and doesn't actually look at the root causes or create longer-term solutions. The book looks at a range of institutions. So it begins by looking at Hollywood and efforts to include Muslims in representations. And then it turns to law enforcement by looking at some cases of hate crimes that became headline news over the last 10 years and some complications around, including Muslims in hate crime classifications and how law enforcement deals with it. I have another chapter on corporations, looking at the question of cancel culture and specifically moments when people who uttered anti-Muslim speech, who were public figures, were fired from their jobs. So it was an interesting moment where, oh, wow, if you say something anti-Muslim, you can get fired for that. So I look at how corporations are dealing with anti-Muslim racism and seemingly emerging as heroes in this struggle. And the final chapter looks at universities and efforts that universities make to include Muslim students by including reflection rooms, accommodations during Ramadan, but then how all of that falls apart when those very same students are involved in Palestine rights activism. So the objective of the book is to look at the inclusion of Muslims in this moment of diversity, and it's organized around looking at different institutions to get a wider view in terms of the limits and possibilities of diversity for including Muslims. I think Sarah is up.
Great. Thanks, Evelyn. I wasn't sure if this was just going to go right to Suad and Alex or not, but thank you so much for that introduction to this very, very wonderful book. I was really privileged to see an early version of it, and it was lovely to see the final version with an arresting cover and everything else. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it over, I think, to Alex now. So Alex, would you like to start with your questions? And so, I mean, we could just do this as a sort of organic conversation as the questions come up between the two of you. Sound good?
So I'm happy to go, but Suad, are you sure? Because I think we on email. Okay, I'll just go then quickly. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to this forum. I'm really honored to be in conversation with Suad and Evelyn about this important book, which I've also had the privilege of reading in an earlier version. Evelyn, it seems to me that what makes this book, for me, so impactful is that it kind of follows up on work that you have already done on representations of Muslims and Arabs in media. In a previous book, Arab and Muslims in the Media, you document ways that before and after September 11th, 2001, Arab and Muslim representations were mostly negative, reproducing the trope of the terrorist. And yet you also noted at that moment of multicultural representation, there was frequently a simplified good Muslim to balance the representation of the bad one. In this new book, Broken, you register a shift in representations towards greater Arab and Muslim inclusion, and I would put that in quotations, in an era when multiculturalism has given way to diversity and equity discourse. So my first question to you is whether you can bring these books together in order to help us understand what you see as a trajectory, perhaps since 9/11, if not before, and how you assess the possibilities of this change to improve life conditions for the people that you're actually writing about.
Thank you, Alex, for that question. All of my work has been concerned with questions of, I mean, right now the language is Muslim inclusion, but the question of how Muslims are conceptualized in the United States, what pathways are available for inclusion. And so both of the books really take up those kinds of questions, but at different time periods to track how it's changing. Both books are also concerned about cultural politics. I consider myself a cultural studies scholar. I'm not a historian, so I tend to write about what's happening here and now. So while I'm writing, I don't know where it's going. I don't know where it's going to end. So the first book tends to look at the first 10 years after 9/11, and then the second book is what happens in the 10 years later. The first book was inspired by watching TV after 9/11. Like so many other people were, glued to the television trying to figure out what had happened. And I started seeing quote unquote sympathetic images of Arabs and Muslims after decades of demonizing them. And I was curious about who is this figure that's a patriotic Muslim, that's in the CIA, that's in the FBI, or Muslims who are victims of hate crimes, and what is it doing for the war on terror and in the war on terror? And does this mean we've reached a new era where there are more diversified representations? And what I found with the first book is that those seemingly positive images were actually fueling a narrative about the war on terror and justifying exclusion. And it often came in forms like, I look at Giorgio Agamben's logic of exception, where he says that power is advanced through this notion of exception. So with the war on terror, the logic was something like this. We don't believe in racism. It's a terrible thing. But because of the state of national security, we have to racially profile Arabs and Muslims, or of course, we're against torture. The US doesn't believe in torture. We are enlightened and we believe in human rights, but given the state of national security, we have to torture or they're going to get us. So I look at these logics and then how the images are feeding those logics. There's a lot of remorse. There's a lot of, we feel so bad that we're doing this, but we have no choice. And so the positive images were circulating to help this logic and this affect. I look a lot at affect in the first book. And I look at TV dramas, news reporting, and nonprofit advertising. With the second book, I feel like the first two chapters on the media are a continuation of the book in some way, and then it diverges when it looks at different institutions into a different direction. But it's asking, okay, well, what happens next in terms of representation? And we're still getting the patriot Muslim who fights and dies for the United States to prove that they're worthy. But then we start seeing different iterations of Muslims, and these different iterations exemplify what's possible in terms of how we imagine Muslims in the United States. So we start seeing secular Muslims who are a contrast to this image of a fanatical Muslim. So we have Aziz Ansari and Kumail Nanjiani and the TV drama Shahs of Sunset, where we have secular Muslims who couldn't care less about their religion, seemingly as a counterpoint to this fanatic. And then we have other possibilities that emerge. But I would say the main difference between them, and something that was very illuminating for me, is that the first book is published 10 years after 9/11, and I don't use the word Islamophobia once in the whole book, because we weren't using that language. It just wasn't how we talked about Muslims and the racialization that was happening at that time. And since then, around 2010, there have been dozens of books with Islamophobia in the title. And some scholars did like a Google word search and show that there was a surge in the use of the term Islamophobia around 2012. And so I think one of the striking things comparing the two books is that the first book is really concerned with this post-race moment, that so many people were saying, we're post-race, this isn't the time of Japanese internment, this is different, this war on terror. And we're about to elect our first Black president. So we're in a post-race moment, and a lot of denial and gaslighting of racism. And then with the second book, because of Donald Trump and because of his very explicit racism and promotion of white supremacy, the public reacted differently to him, which I think is a testament that people respond to explicit, overt, in your face. I mean, and many of us would argue war on terror was very overt and in your face. But we didn't have the same response in terms of concern about Muslims that we did when Trump was in office. So we went from a post-race moment to this explicit moment of racism, white supremacy, and diversity being posited as a possible solution to challenge all of that.
Can you hear me?
You froze for a second, but now yes.
Okay, all right, that's good. So now I have a tension because I wanted to say something about the Trump thing, but I'm like, okay, wait. Anyway, so so I wanted to talk about, I wanted to ask you about race, and specifically Blackness when talking about the representation. So the first kind of two chapters is continuation, right, of your first project. Because like I noticed, right? So, and you and I talked about this, right? This Arab and Muslim dyad that really gets on my last nerve, right? And the ways in which, like, you know, that kind of goes together. And in your book, right, the shows like The Shahs of Sunset or All American Muslim, the people in those shows, they fit that diet easily, right? Either they're Arab and Muslim or they're Middle Eastern and Muslim, right? You know, which is partially a consequence of, you know, sort of the industry, right, that likes to collapse things, right? But it made me wonder, you know, if in fact, and you talk about them specifically in terms of this idea of being a good Muslim or being this nominal Muslim, right? So this kind of secular Muslim. And because none of those characters are Black, right, it made me wonder if in fact, an African descendant Muslim could be a good or a nominal Muslim, because I was thinking about, in terms of television in particular, I was thinking about Regina King's character in American Crime, who's definitely not a good Muslim, but she's definitely not like secular. Or, you know, The Godfather of Harlem that came out recently, and the main Muslim character is Malcolm X in Nation of Islam, and they're definitely not good Muslims, right? They're definitely not secular. So I was like wondering about that, and that's a kind of the sub question to the bigger question, right? This failed promise of inclusion, right? Does it depend for Muslims in the experience of that? Does it depend on who you are racially? Like, are we all, you know, is it different for everybody, or is it the same? So that's kind of my question.
Yeah, thank you for that. So are Black Muslims part of this Muslim inclusion moment? And the answer is yes and no. So no is the bigger answer, and then there's like a little yes. The no part is that, as you said, Arab and Muslim identities have historically been co-produced. And so in this moment of Muslim inclusion, it most directly benefits, when it is beneficial, or impacts Arabs, and then adjacent identities, Iranians, South Asians. And what ends up happening is that even if you are an Arab and you are not Muslim, there can be openings for you too. So, you know, like on college campuses, when there's an Islamophobic incident and there are DEI initiatives, that's an opportunity to talk about, why isn't there a MENA box? Why is there no Middle Eastern, North African box, whether you're Muslim or not? So it ends up opening and benefiting Arabs, Iranians, South Asians. So the focus is mainly on those identities and how they've been co-produced. But then part of this diversity moment at times in the realm of representation has been, okay, if we're diversifying representations, we're also diversifying representations of Muslims and coming to understand that Black people are Muslim too. So we have, for example, Halima Aden, who's a model. She's Black. She was in Sports Illustrated.
But is she Black?
Okay. Meaning
not for
she's,
her, but yeah, but like in terms of how
she's read.
Right, what the story, what her story, right?
Or how about Ibtihaj Muhammad, Barbie doll after Ibtihaj Muhammad, the Olympian who's a Black Muslim, and she was also the face of the Nike hijab. So there are these little moments. They're not like across the board. Patriotic Muslims, there are two that come to mind who are Black. One is Michael Ealy, who plays Darwin Al-Said in Sleeper Cell, which I write about in the first book. And he is an FBI agent, infiltrates a Muslim sleeper cell, and he's the good patriot. So we have that example. And then more recently on Jack Ryan, Wendell Pierce plays Jim Greer, and he is a Black Muslim FBI agent. Season 1, they have a Muslim terrorist, and so his Islam matters in the storyline. Season 2, there's a Latin American threat, and there may be 2 small references to him being Muslim. Season 3 that I just finished watching, the threat is Russian. And I said to my husband at the end, it doesn't matter anymore that he's Muslim. It's like it's been erased. It's irrelevant now to who, and my husband said, I think he said inshallah once. So there might have been like a moment, a tiny moment that I blinked and I missed it. So there are these small moments. And then on Orange is the New Black, Alison Abdullah is a prison inmate. And what's notable about her is that her backstory is that she's in a polygamous marriage and she's upset about it. So there's this stereotyping that's happening. So, and on NCIS, LL Cool J, around the era of the Muslim ban, came out as Muslim.
Oh.
Yeah, so the point is that there are small moments. Cam Copeland is on this, I see on Zoom, and he's a grad student at USC writing an amazing dissertation on Black Muslim representation, and I'm on his committee, and I'm learning tons about Black Muslim representation through him. But I feel like there's a different trajectory, and I think the ones that you name might be part of that trajectory, which is that if Black creatives are making movies, then Black Muslims are included. So Lena Waithe right now, The Shy, has Common playing an imam. So it's like a different trajectory. And in my conversations with Cam, I've learned about, Boys in the Hood and Menace to Society, of course, Malcolm X, but those are Black filmmakers creating those representations. But I would love to hear what you think about this, since this is your area. But ultimately, no, the Black Muslim experience is not at the center of the promise of inclusion. It's like moments of, oh yeah, and Muslims are Black people, Black people are Muslim too, so let's not forget that, but it's not at the center.
Alex, can I just do one thing? Okay, so I'm gonna ask, because since we're talking about Hollywood, I want to ask my other question about Hollywood. So I was thinking about this, I was like, okay, so racism, you talk about racial capitalism in the book, right? And this idea that racism and capitalism are like bedfellows, right? Like they go together. So I'm thinking to myself, but also, right, that Hollywood is driven by profit. Like that's always been the argument around diversity. Well, you're not gonna sell tickets, that type of thing, right? And then you demonstrate you can sell tickets, and so then we get Black Panther, right? But if racism and capitalism go together, like, can you actually have an anti-racist like TV film landscape if your motive is profit? Like, you know what I mean? Like is inclusion just, a non-starter if that's the context?
Yes.
So that was my other question I wanted to ask you.
I love that question, and I try to grapple with that in the book. So in chapter 2 that looks at representations, a particular moment that's around the Muslim ban, and Sarah Benes Weiser's work was actually really helpful to me in conceptualizing this. So Sarah, I would love to hear what you think about this whole profit thing. I write about neoliberal multiculturalism. And what I mean by that is that corporations are taking leadership roles in diversity, and they're saying diversity matters, it's our primary core value, and Hollywood is doing that too. But then with neoliberalism, the focus is on making diversity profitable. And part of the longer trajectory has been diversity is good for business. Diversity is good for education. We all benefit, and you're going to make more money if you do it. And in that process, it gets further and further away from this idea of social justice, from the idea of repairing a history of inequality. So what I found is that when neoliberalism is driving diversity in Hollywood, the result is what I call in chapter 2, the diversity compromise, which means you get something, but it can't go all the way. So Aladdin, for example, which I know we have a lot to talk about with Aladdin, live action remake in 2019. And they did well with casting because there is a very long history of whitewashing back to like early 1900s of having Arab characters played by white people dressed in Arab garb. And so finally, they corrected that because of the Oscar So White movement, because of criticisms about whitewashing. There was a lot going on for them, and they had produced Ghost in the Shell, which had Scarlett Johansson playing an Asian character, and she's a white woman. The Prince of Persia with Jake Gyllenhaal playing an Iranian. Gods of Egypt with more white people playing. They had a bunch of flops at the box office, so there was a profit motive. Oh, that's not working anymore. People want this other thing. So they casted Arab, South Asian, Iranian actors, but Aladdin is still an Orientalist film. So it's like, you get this, but you can't get that. We'll give you, because audiences are not outraged by Orientalism. Audiences still find it pleasurable and consumable, and it's okay. So I agree with your points that how far can diversity go if the concern is profit? It transforms the project. It's not about what we want it to be about anymore. But even along those lines, for me, shows like Rami, Mo, Sorta, which is about a transgender Pakistani Muslim out of Canada. We Are Lady Parts out of the UK, Ms. Marvel. They are written by Muslims. They represent something that we haven't had before. So for me, that's the promise. Like there's an opening there. And those shows are in a different category for me than most of the other things that are going on.
Is it okay if
Yes,
I
please.
just jump in? Swat, I think that's like such an important question. And I love, Evelyn, your idea about diversity compromise. I actually think, though, that the sort of capitalism, the capitalist context of diversity images in Hollywood is also just as much about what you call in the book crisis diversity, right? So, you know, Oscar's So White, there's these sort of ephemeral crises. And so their response is for a moment to do something different. And we saw like the next year or the year after that, there were literally no nominations of people of color, right? After Oscar's So White, after, you know, Time's Up and Me Too. There's still, you know, there's, you know, that kind of got some attention for a little bit. And then it kind of went back to what is truly a sort of masculinist landscape. So I think the crisis diversity and the diversity compromise are really the way in which capitalism or the capitalist context of media representation adjusts to cultural upheaval, to cultural protest, and it happens not at a structural level necessarily at all, but at a representational level that then works to sort of assuage audiences, especially those audiences who still get a great deal of pleasure out of Orientalism. That's my cynical take, and I tend to be a little pessimistic about this, but I do really appreciate you saying that there's these moments, and I think that those moments are important. Representation still does matter, right? In a context in which visibility matters so much. And so I do think that it's a complicated question, but that capitalism is not designed to actually be inclusive except for under its own logics, which is not actually about structure, I would say. Anyway, sorry, just had to jump in.
I love all of that.
Question.
Glad you did.
Alex, do you have?
Yeah, well, just picking up on this theme, if in media and popular culture, casting choices and narrative have become more diverse, one of the things that your book does a great job of is showing how there's an analog in corporate and higher education worlds, which is the language of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Any of us who have worked in a university, or especially a public university, know that the university's first response to any crisis related to race is to form a task force related to DEI initiatives. And that often is a substitute for investing in either faculty of color or ethnic studies programming or programs in Black studies, Arab Muslim studies, what have you. So could you help me understand sort of why did DEI emerge when it did and in the way that it has? And sort of, can you maybe say a little more about your critique of it in the book, which I think is really, really important.
Thanks, Alex. So diversity has emerged basically to replace affirmative action. So affirmative action was instituted in 1965, recognizing at the end of the civil rights movement that yes, the United States had created an entire system to privilege white people over everyone else, and therefore affirmative action was going to try to repair this through numbers, through hiring and opportunities in education and employment and in other arenas. And there's been backlash against affirmative action since the very beginning. There was a Michigan case in 2003 that I mentioned in the introduction to my book, the Grutter case, where a white woman, Barbara Grutter, sued the University of Michigan. And she said that as a white woman, she had a stellar GPA and she was not admitted to the law school, and that it was reverse discrimination. And what some scholars have written about this case is that it was a pivotal turning point in how diversity was conceptualized, because the University of Michigan, instead of arguing, we are committed to rectifying a history of inequality and creating opportunities for historically marginalized groups, instead they said, diversity is good for education. Everyone benefits. And this is one of these turning points where we start getting the argument, and it's like you have to sell it to people because people don't want it, but it's good for business, but it's good for education. And education, you hear from different points of view and it makes you better for the marketplace. In business, it could be profitable. So we start moving more and more away from these, what I would want to, most of us here would want to rectify inequality and social justice. So diversity ends up emerging to replace affirmative action. And in that process often gets watered down. On the one hand, it expanded who's possible to include, because with affirmative action, it was Black, Native American, Latinx mainly, and now it's Muslim, LGBTQ, differently abled, people who are neurodiverse. It can include a lot of people who have been historically excluded, but at the same time, it could also easily turn into, on college campuses, Republicans saying that their views aren't included. So it can become a free-for-all. Well, if everyone's included, then what about a white man who's a Republican, and what about my views? And it's like, well, that's not what this is for. You have your views, you historically have been included here, and then everything gets dumped into this. It ends up being a free-for-all where everything gets negotiated there. What I look at in terms of the university is what happens when many Muslim students get involved in Palestinian activism, and how that plays out and leads to the most extreme form of exclusion that you could experience as a student on a campus, where there are organizations targeting you, putting you on blacklists, sending you hate mail, death threats, and then you talk about not belonging on a campus and not having protection or advocacy to really help you maneuver that kind of situation. So on the one hand, you can have prayer spaces, you can have accommodations during Ramadan, but then when push comes to shove and when you really need support and help, how that unravels. And in that particular chapter, I call it flexible diversity, where the university is trying to include everyone, and they don't want to exclude any kind of student. And in the process, diversity becomes meaningless because everyone's included, and we don't even think about power differentials and how to maneuver power in those kinds of situations. What have you observed, Alex?
Well, if anybody has read the Chronicle of Higher Ed recently, Penn State decided to shift $3.5 million commitment from a racial justice center to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, which has really meant hiring more administrators, it seems to me, often diverse administrators, but with very little consequence or outcome for students or for faculty and staff. So, I think your analysis really spoke to what I perceive happening as well. And, you do a really good job of showing how it's a kind of transformation from an outcomes-based notion of redistributive justice to one that's much more, you say, neoliberal and focused on sort of personal resolutions, feelings, rather than any kind of structural change.
Yeah, I'm gonna open it up to the group for Q&A now, but I was just gonna say, Alex, also, to Suad's earlier point about capitalism and representation, DEI task force are also a response to what you call crisis diversity, Evelyn. So there's a crisis, and so a task force is formed. It's not a long-term solution like investing in an ethnic studies program or investing in students or investing in faculty. And I mean, my personal opinion is that task force are just like where social action goes to die, because there's, it's like a 1-year thing, and it's kind of very hard to figure out what happens out of them. But anyway, this has been a great conversation, and I am moderating this conversation. So please use your raising hand button, since I can't see both screens. And Omar, I see that you have your hand up now. So please go ahead with your question.
Yeah, thank you so much. And Evelyn, I'm very excited to read this book, and congratulations. I'm glad that you mentioned a little bit about the, I believe it was the flexible inclusion response to diversity, because I was curious about how in the book you frame the issue of, like organizing for Palestine on campuses. And part of that is because, it seems to me that a lot of the repression or the backlash to Palestine work also sometimes will take the form of kind of like a seemingly affirmative validation of inclusion, because it becomes, well, we're including everybody. And, by, sort of affirming this conflation between Zionism and Jewish identity, we're actually protecting safety on campus. But in reality, it becomes sort of a way for, validating basically like the marginalization or outright repression, where even the stuff you mentioned, the blacklisting is very much downplayed if ignored. You don't really have administrative, not attacks, but condemnations of things like, Canary Mission or Stop Anti-Semitism, which are honestly, fringe right-wing things that masquerade as sort of like advocacy organizations. And so I guess I'm wondering, how to hear a little bit more about how, or if you engage the issue of the different ways that diversity in this context is used to kind of trade, I guess, the categories of, victim or victimized or marginal, those who are marginalized and those who are experiencing marginalization through the question of Palestine specifically.
Thank you, Omar, for that question. In the chapter, I have a small section where I distinguish between universities that actually engage in punishing students who are involved in Palestine rights activism. For example, Fordham or UC Irvine, where students might have to go to court because they disrupted an event and they bring in the legal system, or they ban Students for Justice in Palestine. So there are certain instances where universities are actually involved in punishing those student groups. And then there are other universities that don't explicitly punish, and that's really the focus of my chapter. And most of it is about what I observed when I was at the University of Michigan for 14 years and how things would play out. And the University of Michigan was not one of these universities that would explicitly punish students. They would really try to say, okay, we're going to meet with you, we're going to hear you, we're going to protect your free speech. There were some important moments where external Zionist organizations asked the president to condemn Palestinian rights students, and he, as a Jewish man, refused to condemn them. And he said, they're doing free speech, they're not doing anti-Semitism, and he had these moments where he made that clear. But even with some like basic, I don't think I want to call it support, but not opposition, efforts to keep everyone, even with efforts to try to include everyone, if there are external organizations that are very powerful that are trying to destroy you, and if the university is not stepping in to say, we're going to try to shut down Canary Mission and we're going to protect these students, the damage is just so great. And I saw so many students really suffering, worrying about their future careers, worrying about death threats that they were receiving. And it's, I know because you've been a part of this, that it's just such, when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, well, what do you do with this when it's so extreme and it's such an extreme form of exclusion? And then the real inequality becomes evident when students who are advocating for Israel have Hillel on their side and have other institutions that are really well funded and really well organized. And at Michigan, they were sending people from DC to campus to help students create their talking points. And then in contrast, those who are advocating for Palestinian rights, they don't have backing. They don't have organizations backing them. They don't have a bunch of talking points. So there's also this extreme inequality. And when we're trying to include everyone, we're failing to address that extreme inequality, the result is a complete and utter failure of diversity. So that's what I look at the chapter, like what happens when universities who are actually committed to including Muslim students, and then they're involved in Palestinian activism. How does that play out? And what happens to those students? And what do we do ultimately with this experience that so many Arab and Muslim students have had on campuses of this unbelievable experience of exclusion when they're on a campus that claims to want to support and include them? Thanks for your question.
Thank you.
We have,
sorry. Did you have is there another question? Sorry.
no, go ahead. Go ahead, Swati.
I was going to say something. I was going to just say, I think thinking about what you just said about the DEI and also what Alex was saying earlier, and one of the things that struck me when I was reading the book is kind of this through line is the ways in which, like in the United States, racism, continues to be this individual action that's just this kind of aberration from the norm, and this continued sort of absence. It's like everything else in the United States, like the absence of a kind of structural analysis, structural support, from picking yourself from your bootstraps, right, to DEI, right? So now you have these students, right, who, because of structural inequalities, right, are not on a level playing field, right? Or you have, like in your other chapters on racial gaslighting and the racial purging, right? All these ways in which, like, so we will, kind of can't get somebody fired, right? An individual gets fired for something they said about Muslims, but the policies that are in place, right, that disproportionately target groups remain in effect, right? And there's ways in which, and it occurred to me kind of like that individual, that thing, this was a through line in your book, made me think about how what you're talking about, while the subject matter for your work is Muslim inclusion, but you're really sort of talking about the ways in which kind of race, like kind of the life of race in the US more broadly, right? And how this continues to play itself out. So I just wanted to share that as well.
Thank you for that. Yes, one of the key points that emerges in many of the chapters is that how race is dealt with in the United States is as an individual problem. It's an aberration. It's something unusual. So for example, there's a hate crime. An individual did it, and we're going to deal with the individual, and the individual will be brought to justice and they will be in prison for the rest of their lives. But we don't have to address the national security state that's racializing Muslims as a threat to national security, how that's feeding the individual actions. And then it seems like, well, the state cares about Muslims because these people who committed hate crimes against Muslims are going to jail. And then similarly with corporations who are emerging as heroes, well, we're going to fire Juan Williams from NPR because he said he's scared to fly in an airplane with Muslims. And then Fox News is going to hire him on a multi-million-dollar contract. But it means if we fired him, then we've gotten rid of racism. It's done. The individual, we've removed the individual, and the public, we're applauding. Yes, down with racism, get rid of this racist individual, and we're not dealing with the actual systems in place. I hadn't thought about that in terms of how it applies to educational institutions, but I really like what you said about how it's being treated like these students are doing this thing, rather than what are the structures and what are the power structures and inequalities that are informing the situation. Thanks for that slide.
Daniela?
Thank you so much. I was wondering, so much of the conversation today about representation has focused on Hollywood and on US entertainment media depictions. And I was wondering if you could connect that to the news media, which is a major source of representation and has been in the last decades, and also sort of shifts the lens a little bit because it's both US and transnational, transregional. So I just wanted to bring journalism into this conversation and ask you about your choice of focus.
Yes, thank you. So yes, Hollywood is my jam. That's like the thing I focus on. And on my first book, I do have two chapters that focus on journalism, actually. And the news media is very important in the conversation about how Muslims are represented, how Muslims are included. And what comes to mind around this question of journalism are two studies that were released in the last few years. I think it was in 2018, the University of Alabama released a study that said that when Muslims are perpetrators of violence, the news media reports on it 357% more than when white people commit acts of violence. So it really highlights this problem that it's not just in the media that we're in Hollywood that we're getting terrorists for decades and decades, but that messaging is reinforced through the news media, reinforced through government speech, politician speeches, reinforced through policies. It's not the issue of one TV show, but it's this repetition. Another study from 416 Labs looked at the New York Times from 1990 until I think 2014, and found that more than half of the stories attributed terrorism to collective responsibility. So we are all responsible for violence, according to news stories. So it's no wonder that all Muslims feel like they have to speak and defend and say something, denounce terrorism. We're all in this situation. We're all collectively responsible for this. So I do think that the news media is really important, plays a huge role. There's another study that comes to mind. Professor Muniba Salim at University of California at Santa Barbara did a study that showed that when we consume images of Muslims as terrorists repeatedly, and she focuses mainly on the news media, that we're more likely to support policies that restrict civil liberties for Muslims in the US, and more likely to support war in Muslim majority countries. So I think in this larger conversation about Muslim inclusion, exclusion, that the news media has been fueling anti-Muslim racism, has been focusing on crisis moments like terrorism that adds more and more fuel to the fire and more fear about Muslims, reinforcing this idea of Muslims as a threat to national security. And then Hollywood chimes in and rips from the headlines and makes stories about what's on the news, and keeps us very much in the cycle. One thing I've noticed just from my own personal experience in the last 10 years is I've noticed in terms of the journalists who contact me, that more journalists contact me now than they did 10 years ago. And it's because many of them are either Arab or Muslim themselves. And so I think that the stories are changing because of who is in the room, and that there are more and more Arab and Muslim women in particular who are going into journalism. And so I have a little bit of hope for the field because of that. Thanks for that, Daniela.
Evelyn, can I follow up on that? I feel like the total doomsayer here, because you just said I feel a little bit of hope, and I'm going to ask a depressing question. But and I know you just finished this book, and you should enjoy just the fact of being finished this book before you go on to your next. But I was wondering what you've been thinking, and this has come up in this conversation, how your arguments about diversity are, you focus on Muslim Americans and Muslims, but it's also an argument about race, right, in the contemporary moment. And I can't help but think that this boom, which was really a very lucrative boom for universities and corporations to go into DEI, there's now such a pushback from politics, right? And I'm thinking of DeSantis and banning the African American history AP class, and the pushback against CRT, and the sort of derisive and appropriative use of the term woke in this way that is a sort of in relation to how diversity is being used. So I just wanted to know if what you thought about that, and if that is the next step in this cycle that you have so beautifully traced in your books.
Yeah, I've been collecting those articles because I'm just very interested to see you know, this is our field as ethnic studies scholars that's being attacked. And what I find, you know, interesting is that throughout history, we have these, you know, you make a little progress and there's a backlash, you know, so backlash to affirmative action, there's a backlash to diversity too, even if it's completely watered down, there's still a backlash. People don't want it. People want to maintain, you know, whatever there was before. So yeah, it might be the next thing, Sarah. We'll see. But I've been following it and saving newspaper articles and wanting to just see how this plays out, because I'm very interested.
Just really quickly, because I know there's a hand up. What if it's not a backlash, but actually has been opened up by the very politics to remedy diversity and equity in the first place?
Yeah.
Like what if DeSantis is the consequence of DEI logic rather than of affirmative action or any redistributive justice models?
Yeah. I love that, Alex.
Yeah, that's great. And I think you're right too. Rosina?
Yes, hi. It's been a
Hi,
long
Rose.
time. How you doing?
Good, thanks.
Yeah, I'm glad I could manage it between classes. I have some trepidation with asking this question because I think I know what the answer is and it's not good. But I would ask, are there any positive examples? Who and where is doing who and where are they doing inclusion of Muslims correctly? Do we have positive examples that we can put forward?
So for me, I do think it's significant that we have Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar in Congress. I do think they're part of a collective of people who are changing the conversation. So they're, you know, they're little moments. How much they will be able to accomplish is a whole other issue, because there's so much opposition in Congress. Who knows if you can get anything done, but they're changing the conversation. So I see that. And as I mentioned earlier, for me, those 5 shows that I mentioned, I watch them and I think, wow, what if I had this when I was growing up? What if I saw diverse, like, Muslim people on television, you know, in all kinds of various human conditions? So I feel like there are moments. I guess the question is, let me put it this way. Hollywood responded to the Muslim ban by creating characters outside of Hollywood, and that's why we have these 5 shows. But is the crisis the Muslim ban, or is the crisis a history of Hollywood filmmaking that has misrepresented practically every? So when I think about moving forward, I think, okay, we need to do root causes. So for Hollywood, it's, you know, a very egregious, long-standing system of misrepresenting and stereotyping many groups. So how about if that should be the focus? And then it should be a long-term solution, not a quick fix. So great that the Muslim ban inspired change, but Hollywood should be focusing on the damage it has done itself for 100 years plus. And great that it was inspired by the Muslim ban, but the problem is not the Muslim ban. The problem is this history of inequality that and white supremacy that's so ingrained in our culture.
If I could follow up for a second, do you think these shows are going to be long lasting, or is this a flash in the pan? And then that's the question.
I agree. I have no idea. I feel that if we're working along crisis diversity, then they've done their job and we're done. One of the things I was hoping to talk to Alex about, but I know we're running out of time, is about the war on terror. And Alex wrote a book, Never Ending War on Terror. Right now, for 20 years, we were living in the war on terror. Every single day on the news, consuming it. And right now, we're focusing on other things: pandemic, white supremacy, BLM. So I'm not sure in terms of crisis level if this trend will continue or not, but I'm watching with a lot of interest to see.
So we have 2 questions, but we have to end right at 1 p.m. California time sharp. So Elias had a question about what your favorite media outlets were, and then you just disappeared from the screen. I think it was Melissa. Maybe you could write the question in the chat and Evelyn could answer it at a later time. But maybe just quickly, Evelyn, if you could tell Elias, like your favorite English language news media or media outlets that focus on MENA. Is that right, Elias?
That is correct. Good to see you, professors. Happy New Year. Good to see you again for 10 years.
Thank you. I'll just say, since we're running out of time, We Are Lady Parts is where it's at for me. British show that was bought by NBC Peacock, streaming on Peacock. I know Suad doesn't feel the same as me about this show, but for me, I cried out of joy watching it because I've never seen anything like it in my life.
Thank you. Have a great semester.
Thank you.
Well, that is a great way to end on a very hopeful note. We Are Lady Parts, which is an amazing program. And I just want to thank Suad and Alex for your really great questions and the conversation, and everyone in the audience for listening in. And again, congratulations, Evelyn, on this wonderful, brilliant book. It's really going to make such an important impact. And your scholarship is, as always, a complete pleasure to engage with and to read. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And just 30 seconds before everybody goes, thank you, Evelyn, for the book. Thank you to Sarah, Suad, and Alex for this engaging conversation. Thank you also to our co-sponsors, the Department of American Studies and Ethnicity at USC and the Annenberg Center for Collaborative Communication, which co-sponsored this book chat. And our next book chat will be on April 24th. Christina Dunbar-Hester will be talking about her new book, Oil Beach: How Toxic Infrastructure Threatens Life in the Ports of Los Angeles and Beyond. Thank you so much, and congratulations, Evelyn.